thank you. So as previously mentioned, I'm Ryan. I lead the pricing team and actually our product finance team at Snowflake. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about where we sit in the org, how our pricing team is designed and why we designed it that way. But I'm also going to kind of walk you through the life cycle of how we make pricing decisions and how we actually launch pricing into the market. I think you're gonna see how cross-functional it really is once you start to walk through that journey. And then I'll share a little bit about some of the things that we've learned at Snowflake as we've kind of evolved that process and matured that process. And then hopefully I'll give you guys some things you can start to think about and maybe even apply, like starting on Monday. So again, yeah, I'll walk you through the Snowflake playbook. I'll talk about the lessons learned, and then we'll focus on some takeaways. I don't know if anybody's done Q&A, but I'm happy to do Q&A if I finish early. All right, so let me start with, and I think Scott talked about this in the beginning. At Snowflake, the way we think about it is monetization is really a system. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we're making a decision on what price point we're going to charge and the metric that we're going to use. But there are so many things that go into that decision that it is really important, not only that you get the team right, but the process right, and that you have all the inputs that you're going to need to be able to make that decision. And so, if we think about this flywheel here, I'll just hit the points really quick because we'll go into them in more detail here in a second. But, one of the things that I've really learned, and by the way, actually, one other aside point, as I've talked to a few folks here throughout the day, I'm going to try to stay away from walking through kind of the canned answer and what's best practice. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what makes a lot of this really hard. And at Snowflake, to be honest, we don't do this perfectly. In fact, I've got a lot of stories where we've skipped steps. We've done steps where we got the wrong information. We took steps where we didn't communicate with the right people. And I personally believe that is a lot more of probably this audience's lived reality. So as we kind of go through this whole cycle and talk about some of the decisions we've made, I really want to stress that nobody has this perfect today, but it is all about every time you continue to make these pricing decisions that you get better and better and better. And I've been at Snowflake for about 3 years now, and I would say we're in a much better place today than we were 3 years ago, built on the back of a lot of great work from a lot of different people. But the first thing that's the most important here is, as the pricing leader, I want to get involved as soon as I possibly can. When you are getting a product, especially a new product, a tier 1 product, something that's really important for the company, and you're finding out about it 3 weeks before launch, the only decision you can really make at that point is, was the PM smart or not, and am I willing to go to the chief product officer and delay the launch? So one thing that I've really stressed and tried to do is, how do I build myself into the fabric of how our product organization works, right? How am I in all of the roadmap discussions? How am I in all the steering committee meetings? Am I talking to product, every single week, having lunches, building relationships? Because I want to hear about things as soon as I possibly can. And fortunately, through a lot of hard work, I've built a process now where we're at the table when these things first start getting discussed. That's the only way, in my mind, that you can actually really define, what are the principles we're going to organize around when it comes to pricing? What are the targets? What are the goals that we want to accomplish? What are the types of customer segments that we're going to go after and we're trying to win? How much of that is the big existing customer versus trying to land new logos? So I would say on the define piece, one of the things that our team is really focused on is, how do we shift left? How do we get involved in the process as early as possible? Second step, an area, frankly, we don't do that well today. I'd love to be better. It's all about research, right? I think Madhavan talked about this earlier. How do you bring in insights around willingness to pay? What a customer values? How do I measure that? How do I bring that in, when we're writing the product review document and not finding out about it 6 months after the product launches? Thinking about what your competition is doing and benchmarking how our pricing stacks up to theirs. And if it's different, how do I explain that it's different? And testing some of that with customers in live conversations. So I've built a team that leverages our user research organization, even some of our sales ops teams that help us get time with customers to go have those conversations. Then you got to bring it all together, right? You got to put that research and compare that against the hypothesis that you had in the define stage. This is, again, where you've got to close the loop with that product stakeholder. The way we operate today is we try to take as much of that research lift off of the product leads. I mean, they want to be involved, they want to get the insights, but we want to go do the hard blocking and tackling of going and doing all that work to give them leverage. They've got 1,000 things going on. I kind of joke internally, I want to be an insight as a service for those PMs. And so that builds a lot of credibility with them. Again, it helps me continue to get asked to be in the room earlier and earlier and earlier. And it also makes it very seamless that when we come back into the design phase and we finally put together the proposal, we're all aligned, right? Because we've had those conversations, we've brought them along via the research. But I will tell you, we talked earlier in the day, speed, 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 speed. One of the things you potentially sacrifice when you move really fast is you don't do all the research you want to do. It takes a long time to run a pricing survey, right? It takes a long time to go talk to a bunch of customers. You know, oh, I'm not available. I'll call you next week when I'm back in the office. So I'll talk about it a little bit later when we talk about the lessons that we've learned, but I would say don't skip the research. The next step is really all around the decision, and this is where we talk about the governance. This is really important. And it's really important, one, because internally I use it as a forcing function to get people to pay attention and get people to care. You know, if I say, hey, if you don't get it approved at pricing committee, then audit's going to come get us in trouble. People stand up and they start to pay attention. But it's also a really important process to align a lot of other key stakeholders, right? I almost joke internally that it's a marketing event to go tell sales, to go tell legal, to go tell all these critical functions who sit in our pricing committee, hey, what is this thing? How does it work? How does it scale? How does that impact the contract process? So the decision point is critical as well. And then finally, you know, it doesn't stop when the pricing decision's made and the product gets launched. There's a feedback loop, continuing to find out how do I enable the field so that they really understand it? How do I measure whether the pricing decision was right or wrong? And that's not just quantitatively, that's qualitatively as well. And then how do I iterate? We talked earlier as well, we got to iterate fast. At Snowflake, we're an enterprise software company, we're a publicly traded company. It's hard to change pricing that often, but we are constantly trying to iterate and learn and admit when we've made mistakes and move on. So let's start with who does what at Snowflake. So when I think about pricing, there's kind of the pricing strategy and the pricing design, and then there's the actual implementation and the execution of that pricing. You know, how do I actually deal hand-to-hand with customers live in the market when it comes to that pricing? My team, what you would consider the pricing team at Snowflake, we're on the left. We handle all of the actual pricing policy. We set the pricing principles. We work very closely with the product organization to think through the pricing strategy and how we want to set the list price. But we also work very closely with our deal desk team, and we enable the deal desk team. We collaborate on big deals where there's non-standard opportunities. But the deal desk team is really more of our arms and legs on actually executing transactions with the customers. I've been asked by a few folks today, I don't get too involved with individual discounts on customers. That is something our deal desk team owns. And our responsibility is really, if the discount matrix is wrong, or we need to evolve the discount matrix, we work really closely with deal desks to do that, but we don't do every single deal. The second big important part is how do I design the pricing team itself? There's a few different models that I've seen throughout my career. And I would say, you know, we started when I first joined Snowflake more on the left, which was more of kind of a central functional team, where there was a lot of expertise, and we were often coming at the very last minute before a product would go out to kind of make, you know, pricing decisions and validate some of the work that product had done on the way up. However, if we wanted to do what I had first talked about, which was shift left, engage product earlier, and really be embedded with the teams, we felt strongly that we needed to move more and more towards this hub and spoke model. And really what that means is that I have leads on my team that are fully embedded into kind of the major product categories and the major workloads where they have a seat at the table, right? They're kind of iterating with product managers and engineering to think through kind of core pricing decisions. This is one benefit, I will say. I live in finance, so I think on Kevin's slide I was in probably the minority. But I get a lot of value out of playing a pricing role and a finance role. And the reason is also that, you know, the product and engineering organization has a lot of other financial needs as well that we serve as a business partner. And so again, it's kind of that constant ability to always be at the table. But the hub and spoke model, we embed ourselves deeply within those product teams, and then there is a set of best practices and a defined process that we run for pricing decisions that serves as kind of the center of excellence internally. That said, I will say we still do things like run Tiger teams on bespoke, really custom, individual pricing. All right, so now I'm going to walk you through kind of our process. I started about a little bit on this at the beginning. But when we first get engaged in a pricing topic, the first thing we're asking our product stakeholders is really to think about how are we going to define success when it comes to the pricing itself. You know, obviously we first and foremost focus on the pricing metric, right? Is it fair? Is it predictable? You know, customers in a usage-based model care a lot about predictability. We talked about that earlier in the day. One area we really push on is what is the value prop, and are we convinced that customers are willing to pay a premium for what we're offering? And if not, are we too expensive? One of the things Snowflake prides itself on is a simple pricing model. One of our differentiations too is ease of use. And so if you're an easy to use product, you better have a simple pricing model. And so we're constantly debating, you know, how much do we keep it simple versus maybe offer more choice, more flexibility in terms of how the pricing is structured. So we spend a lot of time in that definition state to align. We then move to research, and this is an area again where I would say, you know, I want us to get better. It is very hard to do this at the pace that the current business is running. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity though here to automate. We talked about earlier in the day that if you really want to move fast and scale, how can you automate more and more of the process? I think when it comes to things like understanding your costs, benchmarking competitors, even doing things like the operational diligence, right? Making sure accounting is okay with the revenue recognition, making sure the billing team can actually support the way you want to meter. Build checklists, do a lot of that async, reduce the number of meetings you need to be in. Because frankly, I'd rather take that time and repurpose it to go spend more time talking to customers or running surveys and going and trying to get as much feedback on things like willingness to pay or how valuable the feature is. So we're investing a lot in trying to automate as much of that kind of checklist of, hey, have you actually done all the proper research so that you feel comfortable to stand in front of the pricing committee and tell the CEO we're ready to launch on November 1st. And then the design. So we talked a little bit about you know, going and doing that research, testing the hypothesis that you had in that definitional stage. In the design phase, we're now really kind of all rolling that together. One thing I have found here is you end up churning a lot in this phase. When you do that kind of initial research, that initial checklist, I personally have found a lot of the key stakeholders don't really pay attention. They're kind of telling you the easy answer, and they believe that, okay, I'll start to pay attention once this thing gets closer to launch. So this design phase is an opportunity, I think, to really push those teams to think thoroughly about what does this actually mean when this gets launched. The pricing brief is an incredibly important part of this process. This is kind of putting together the fact pack, putting together the email that's going to go in front of the leaders to make a final decision. One thing I have learned through a lot of mistakes is having a template, having a structure that you lay all this out very clearly can actually make it really easy on a lot of your stakeholders to provide the right information at the right time. I can't tell you how many times we've sent an approval only to find out that somebody didn't have the fact that it wasn't going to be available in some region included, and that was going to have to require a change in the billing engine. Or legal had not actually read the document yet and had a few suggested changes on the way we position that or put that on our order form on the contract. And so we've actually moved to a point where this is very checklist based. I will not even mark this process complete until I've actually had everybody sign off. One other piece that I would just strongly recommend, and this is based on actually a recent story, is don't forget the enablement as well. One thing, especially if you live very close to product and engineering and you spend a lot of time on what's the margin, what's our competitive benchmark, what's our launch date. Often you can forget, especially in an enterprise sales type of company, is, okay, how are we going to go train the field? How do we want to make this easy to understand? And in a place like Snowflake, where we sell infrastructure software, a lot of the things we do is very complicated. And so we want to distill it down. We want to make it super easy. And this enablement stuff takes a long time. And so we've worked really hard to actually pull forward, making sure that the whole enablement plan, the whole enablement story, all the decks are done as we're getting the pricing approved, because we want to make sure that that story makes sense before we make a decision. Because if that story doesn't make sense, or the field has feedback that pushes us down a different path in terms of what we're ultimately deciding, we want to know that before we go through the official approval process. All right, decisions. Unfortunately, Scott, we still run a pricing committee. No, seriously, I think the pricing committee is a really important function. The actual meeting itself, I always joke, is not the important part. The important part is all the prep up to the pricing committee. And again, being in pricing, and I sit in finance, but it is so cross-functional, even you can see on this slide. What I really value as part of the pricing committee process is the ability to go tell all these individual stakeholders, hey, you're going to be in the room. The CEO is going to be in the room. He's going to look at you and say, are you ready? It forces a call to action and an urgency from all of these stakeholders to really weigh in and contribute on big, meaty pricing decisions that can be really important for the company. However, in full transparency, this is an area where we've innovated probably in the last 2 or 3 months, because the pace at which we are approving new products and new features is tremendous. We have over 250 PMs at Snowflake. All of them are building new features every quarter. Most of those features have to be priced. And so there's no way to support all of that through a live traditional pricing committee process. And so again, kind of in the spirit of automation, we figured out ways to even use things like ServiceNow to automate workflows on very standard pricing decisions so that people have all the documentation, they can approve that, it's all logged in a record so that audit recognizes that we've actually gone through the appropriate approval process. And that has allowed us to scale, especially in some of the areas around AI where we're adding models, we're changing models, we're changing pricing every other month. So to me, pricing committee and the governance process is not just the meeting, it's not just the deck, it's actually how do you bring all those stakeholders along and how do you actually get the decision made and how do you decide when you want to actually have a live discussion and a debate and you really want to bring people along, versus when do you want to just automate and get it through, but make sure you're still following the right practice. The last step is really around, I would say, realize and learn. Speaking of a big learning, I was telling Sam at lunch, we recently made a big pricing change at Snowflake. One of our flagship products for data engineering, where you bring data into Snowflake, We had debated whether that thing was too expensive for about 3 years. And we finally made the decision to change the price. And it actually involved two things. It was dropping the pricing level, but it was also changing the pricing metric itself. And one of the things I learned, and by the way, the rollout of that went swimmingly well for customers, painful internally. And the reason it was so painful internally is I think sales didn't fully expect or appreciate how big of a change that was. And salespeople complain when you take revenue away and you don't give them quota relief. So one of the things we learned in that process is, look, for big, meaty pricing decisions, you should actually treat that like a tier 1 product launch. And the way we work at Snowflake, for a tier 1 pricing launch, there is a lot of stuff that goes into that, right? There's product marketing, building out kind of decks and comms. There's PR that goes out with that. There's making sure you're doing all the system testing to make sure that the change is going to reflect accurately in the billing engine. There's quota adjustments. There's preparing FAQs. And so this was an area, again, where you think everything's right, and when it launches, you find out there's still a lot to learn. And so one of the things I've learned as part of this process is to treat big, either new products or pricing changes as a tier 1 launch. The other thing I will say, and again, in the spirit of trying to meet people where they are today, one of the things I hate is, well, we'll throw it out there and we'll price it, and the market will tell us whether we priced it right or not. I hate that excuse. And this is, again, why the research is so important. One of the things we've learned constantly at Snowflake is it's very hard to actually know when you're leaving money on the table. And if you always start pricing it high, and you expect that, well, I can always drop price if it turns out it's too expensive. Yeah, but you don't know how many customers never even tried it because you started high. And so if you think about all the work required to launch a product and get it into market, and all the sales cycles that you are going to burn trying to sell that product, I think there's a lot of opportunity to leverage the learnings you've had from other products and carry that forward. But also make sure you do that research. It's a very cheap way of avoiding expensive sales cycles only to go find out that you're wrong. That being said, I still think there are opportunities to continue to measure and learn on whether you got to the right price point or not, and how easy it is to understand. And that's not just what revenue looks like on the dashboard. It's spending time with customers, it's talking to account teams, it's having other people actually try to explain the pricing back to you. So with that, I wanted to maybe kind of share a few lessons that I've personally learned at Snowflake going through this whole process. I talked about this in the beginning, but one, do not skip the research. And if the research is causing you to slow down, figure out ways to go faster and automate some of the stuff that you're already spending time on so you can free up time to go do that research. It's a very cheap way to know what are the guardrails of what success is going to look like for that price. Communicate far more than you think. This kind of goes back to my learning from the pricing rollout. But even though you think you've talked to all the right people, say it again. Pricing is one of those things, I think, that people don't really pay attention to unless there's a problem. And so making sure that you are constantly repeating that message over and over and over again about how the pricing works to make it super simple to understand. The third point is, in my opinion, in some ways, the launch is even more important than the pricing strategy. I mean, obviously, you want to make sure that it's easy to understand, that you're pricing it in an intelligent way. But if you don't do the launch well, you will confuse people. People won't even find out about it. So it's really important to think through the full long tail of the rollout and the follow-through when you make these pricing decisions. From a talent standpoint, one of the things I've learned is hire strong generalists. Now, if you have acute pain points and needs around, hey, I need a pricing ops person, or I need an analyst, you don't always hire generalists in those scenarios. But when you think about building out your leadership team, you want people who can do a lot of different skills. You want people who can think almost like a product manager. You want people who are good with data. You want people who can get up and communicate well to people who live outside of the pricing or the product organization. You may even want people who can speak the accounting language. So I would encourage you to hire strong generalists. And then the fifth point is really kind of a meta point around, in the areas where you already know what good looks like, try to find ways to automate more and more and more of that. Free up time to go do the discovery, to go do the research, and go do the learnings after things have launched. So with that, there's a few things that I think you can start to do on Monday when it comes to this full end-to-end pricing lifecycle. I would say first and foremost, determine your pricing principles and make those broadly known across the entire organization. The reason I say that is if everybody knows your pricing principles, you can decentralize a lot of decision making, and you don't necessarily need to be in every room for every discussion, and you can give your team a bit of scale. Publish a clear new product introduction process. So this is my point around the launch. Making sure that every single person in the product organization and the key stakeholders along that whole launch journey very clearly understand how a new product goes from a product review all the way to live in the market. And then find ways to drive feedback at scale. And really this is around less the data side. It's more around how do I go get qualitative insights from account teams, from customers themselves, from partners. Find ways to do that, whether it's surveys, whether it's webinars, whether it's even just staying in touch with people that you've regularly contacted who you know have a really good insight on these types of things. So with that, I've learned a lot at my time in Snowflake. I'm a big believer in embedding your teams directly in the business areas that they're serving. And one of the most important things I think you can do is find ways to get involved early and drive leverage in the way that you're collecting feedback. So with that, thank you.